Alright, from lecture 4 through to about lecture 9 we're going to deal with the planning processes. We start with scope management. This lecture is broken up into two parts. Part A is the requirements matrix and defining scope and the scope statement. In Part B we'll look at the work breakdown structure. After completing this short lecture, we'll talk about processes for collecting requirements. We'll talk about creating a requirements traceability matrix, and finally the project scope statement. So these are scope processes. So actually the scope planning processes fall into these categories. This lecture will cover collect project requirements, create a traceability matrix, define project scope, create a project scope statement. In the next lecture we'll look at the work breakdown structure and finally change control. There's two key inputs into the scope processes. They are the charter. The project charter sort of gives an overview of what the project should complete, and the second thing is the stakeholder register. These tell you who your stakeholders are and what their interests in the project are. This is useful because you still need to consult them exactly what attributes or features they're looking for in the product. If you do attend a lecture, you would have done Anu, Dad and Mum building a patio and going through an example of that to sort of consolidate the learning. However, we'll just race through, seeing you're online, and there are a number of processes and a number of outputs. Planning the scope management is basically deciding within your team how you'll go about doing the subsequent steps that you see on the diagram. So your scope management plan is how you will collect requirements, define scope, create a WBS and perform integrated change control. Our requirements are collected from stakeholders, so you use your stakeholder register. The output from that is a stakeholder or a requirements traceability matrix. We'll see that in the next slide or the next two slides, and that has things like what are the needs that the client wants, what features in the asset can we build to meet those needs, which stakeholder requests those features, and finally what's the priority. Scope statement, there's about 8 headings that we need to learn there. We'll see that in the last slide of this lecture. So you're looking for about 8 headings. Scope overview, constraints, risks, deliverables and acceptance criteria. Wait till we get to the last slide. WBS we deal with in the subsequent lecture, and performing integrated change control we'll deal with in the subsequent lecture. Scope management, you've got to, the key idea of this is that we have a product, an asset, a bridge, an IT service, some sort of business change, a new shop, a business idea. We have something that we need to build. That's our product. So the scope is what is required to build that product. But then we have to manage that process. We need to have weekly meetings, there's going to be status reports, there will be stakeholder meetings, there will be websites to be built, there will be intranet sites to manage communication. There will be all sorts of things. That's our project scope. So the total scope, the things that we need to consider when we're looking at our project is what will the bridge look like, what does it require, and finally how will we go about managing the multidisciplinary team and stakeholders to make sure that we deliver that bridge. Total scope, product scope plus project scope. Requirements means you go back to your stakeholders and basically say, why do we want this? What sorts of features are you looking from this particular asset? The requirements matrix asks the stakeholders to say what business needs, what are they trying to achieve out of it. The example we used in the lecture was a patio. One of the requirements was shelter from the sun. The feature that was built was a shade cloth. That sort of idea. Here's the matrix. We're trying to get something that's traceable so we can go back to and say, have we delivered on this business need? So in consultation with your stakeholders, you decide what are the business needs that are required, what are the attributes of the asset that will deliver those, which stakeholder or stakeholders does it affect, and what priority it has. Because if you remember the triangle from the first lecture, is that we've got there will be a trade-off between scope, cost and time. And if we need to limit our scope, then using this traceability matrix tells us, what features are nice to haves and what features are essential. We use those priorities to rank the attributes or the features of the product that we're looking for. Once you've got your traceability matrix, you can then look at defining scope. Defining scope is the process of developing a detailed description of the project and the product. So remember, there's two parts, project scope and the product scope. Essentially, when we get to do the WBS and the WBS dictionary, all the other planning documents rest upon those. So what we want to build helps us decide when we're going to do it, who we require, what communication might be needed to be undertaken, what are the risks involved. So the scope really is the basis. This is the first thing you do in the planning stage. You work out what are the details, how do we go about delivering it. The other important thing about having a defined scope, it avoids scope creep. We talked about that earlier on in the initiation phase, our charter. If we're very clear on what the boundary of the scope, what is in the scope, what's out of scope, that just stops the idea of, oh no, we should have this or we should have that. So scope creep is one of the things that we can use a clear definition of scope to avoid. So what do we do about it? We identify what are the deliverables, what are the acceptance criteria for those deliverables. The project boundaries is what is in scope, what is out of scope. For example, with the patio that we did in class, we talked about the paving was in scope, but including a barbecue or the landscaping around the patio was not in scope. And finally, we create a scope definition, which is a paragraph to describe what's being built. So a scope statement has the following headings. What is the objective of the project? So it's almost like the charter again. A short description of scope. What are the requirements? What does the asset need to achieve? And you can get those from your traceability matrix. Boundaries. Basically, you just put in what is not included in the scope. What are the boundaries? What's in? What's out? We have deliverables and acceptance criteria, so there'll be key parts of the project that you want to be able to look at the building and say, yes, it's got windows, for example. Constraints and assumptions we covered in the class. We looked at constraints as either physical, the backyard is only so big, so we couldn't have a patio that's larger than the backyard, or because of the way the orientation of the house, then the patio needs to go on this plot of land. Whatever it is, it's physical, or it could be regulatory, meaning that because the structure is higher than the fence, it must be at least 1 metre away from the fence. That's a constraint. Assumptions are things that we believe to hold true. The 3 examples that we looked in the class was 1, we assume the project management plan is based on the assumption that when we clear the land to do the patio, there's no limestones or anything under that plot of land, because if there was, we'd have to have a new project management plan. The other thing is that the project management plan is based on the assumption that all approvals would be achieved. I'm not going to go through that here, we're doing short lectures, but typically project management plans for larger projects with environmental impact, they can create the plan, but there's no guarantee that that plan will be the one they can use, because it depends on the outcome of the environmental survey. And finally, things that we believe to hold true but may not. So assumptions are things that we believe to hold true, and in which case, for the example we gave, that all materials could be sourced readily by Anu and his dad, but it's possible they don't hold true, in which case they come out of the assumption bucket and into the risk bucket. So you might hear this in any decision making: we need to challenge the assumptions. The things that we believe to hold true that will work for this project, and we don't need to worry about it, we don't need to manage it. If we test that assumption and we do, we find that there is a possibility that what we thought would hold true isn't, it comes out of that assumption bucket and into the risk bucket, where we have a series of procedures for managing, mitigating, transferring risk. Okay, that covers scope. So we had two parts. The definition of scope went into two phases actually. We had the requirements matrix, which is what is it, what are the business needs, what do you want out of this product, therefore what features does the product have, and that requirements matrix helped us define scope in this thing called a scope statement.